Oh, okay. Right. Thanks very much for coming. In case you're in the wrong place, this is a Burack lecture. And the Burack lecture is part of a lecture series that brings distinguished speakers to UVM to interact with students and teachers, but also the general public. And so I'm grateful beyond words to Carol and Dan Burack, who've made this series possible, but also to the philosophy department for supporting this particular talk, Susan Munkris in the Office of Community University Partnerships, Libby Miles, and the English department, and Bob Peppermint Taylor in the political science department. This particular talk is going to be by Larissa MacFarquhar, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she's written profiles of some very famous people, like Noam Chomsky and Barack Obama, and some people who are not very famous, but are very famous in small cults, like Derek Parfit and the English professor Stanley Fish. But she's also written profiles of people who are not famous at all, people who are what you might think of as just totally normal people, like a mom who loses her children to the state, or a history professor in West Virginia who is a Trump voter, or a family or a man who gives away a kidney to a perfect stranger. So some of these profiles of totally normal people coalesced into a book, Strangers Drowning, and for me, Strangers Drowning is one of the greatest books I have ever read in my life. It is extremely moving. For me, it was a source of incredible joy, but also deep puzzlement and inspiration, but also just something that I think keeps me going through both dark times and not dark times. So for me personally, this is just an incredible honor to have Larissa here, and thank you so much for coming.
Can you hear me? Tyler, thank you so much for that introduction. I mean, I have to say one of the most wonderful things about publishing this book has been, I've been preoccupied for a very long time with people of extraordinary moral commitment, and I sometimes felt quite alone in that interest. And but since the publication of this book, people like Tyler who share my preoccupation have gotten in touch with me, and that's been a wonderful blessing. So thank you, and thank all of you. I will seek to make you similarly preoccupied. I've got about 45 minutes to do it, so I'm going to try. And I think that I will be a little bit helped by the fact that this is Vermont. I'm going to tell you about one couple. One of the people I'm going to talk about, or one couple that I'm going to talk about, are from Vermont, from Barrie, not very far from here. And when I was talking to friends and relatives of theirs, there was a very strong sense. I was told that this was being a very moral person was a Vermont thing to do, and I should not be surprised. I could be surprised elsewhere to find such people, but not in Vermont. So I'm assuming that the barrier to persuasion is somewhat lower here than it is in most places. Let's hope. Anyway, as Tyler mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about a certain kind of human, certain kind of human character who arouses conflicting emotions, at least outside the state, the do-gooder. And I'm not talking about an ordinary kind of do-gooder, a kind of person who perhaps volunteers at a homeless shelter once a week or has a job in which he or she does something really worthwhile. I'm talking about someone who pushes him or herself further to a kind of moral extremity, someone who commits himself totally, the kind of do-gooder, in other words, who makes many people uncomfortable. And the usual way to do good is to help people, your people around you, whether you know them or not. So when I was writing this book, it was the height of the Ebola epidemic, and I was thinking about those nurses and doctors in the hospitals where a lot of Ebola patients were suddenly arriving, and they had been completely ordinary people, and then suddenly they had to be extraordinary. They had to stay there for 24, 36, 72-hour shifts. They had to risk their lives, risk a horrible death, possibly by dying, abandoning their own children for the sake of their patients. So they suddenly became extraordinary. But because they hadn't sought this out, and they were just helping their community in a way that their job required, I call that kind of person a hero. And that kind of person I don't feel that most of us are conflicted about, because it's something that's thrust upon them, this sudden requirement to be extraordinary. And it's not uncomfortable for the rest of us because there's no reproach in their work. We weren't there. We're not part of that community. And so we can always imagine that we would have done the same thing had we been there. Do-gooders, on the other hand, is a different kind of person. Not better or worse than heroes, but more rare and harder to understand. These are people who do go looking for trouble. They aren't spontaneous, but they plan their good deeds in advance, in cold blood. They may plan out an entire life of good deeds in advance. And they also don't necessarily feel obliged to help their own people. They want to do as much good as they can, wherever that might be. So there's a more cerebral and removed aspect to this kind of doing good. And these people are a reproach to the rest of us, and I think this is one of the reasons they make us uncomfortable, because we all know, as they know, that there is always somewhere a need for help. And they also suggest that it's not good enough to just help our friends and our neighbors. They suggest by their own example that we're required to push ourselves further. But to some extent, we have only so much time, we have only so much energy, we have only so much money. So it's not a simple matter of feeling good about doing more. It's a zero-sum game. Once you push yourself beyond a certain point, helping others, helping strangers is going to conflict with caring for your family. And so it's a complicated decision. And that's what I want to talk about. And the original reason I started on this project was because I had a question that I couldn't answer, which I find genuinely puzzling, which is, why don't the rest of us, and I very much include myself in this, why don't the rest of us do more than we do to help other people? And the reason I find this genuinely puzzling is because, as we all know, giving makes you feel good. Giving something away often makes you happier than keeping it. So even if you believe that people are selfish, it's still a puzzle that we don't do more, because this is a very reliable way to feel happy. And the usual answer is, we're human, we're selfish, we're lazy, we're weak-willed, we like our stuff too much to give it up, and obviously all of that is true. But I don't think it's the whole story. Another reason is that the need of the world is infinite, is seemingly so overwhelming, that to open your mind to it is frightening and intimidating. And you can think that to make a serious attempt at doing something about it, to live a seriously good life, would involve a frightening amount of sacrifice. And then there's the question of what is a good life. We could probably all agree that most of us should do a little more than we do, but how much should we do? The kind of person I'm going to talk about today, for them this is a very difficult and essential question, because once you push yourself beyond a certain point, it's not just a matter of giving up extra shoes or extra cappuccinos, but things that are much more precious, like spontaneity, like certain kinds of beauty, certain kinds of freedom. And as I said, if you help strangers beyond a certain point, you are doing so at the expense of caring for your family. So the question is, what matters most in life? And I'll give you an example to show you the kind of thing I'm talking about. The man I want to talk about first is Baba Amte, who he grew up, he was born in 1914, he's now dead, as you might imagine, but he grew up in pre-independence India, right in the middle of India near Nagpur, and he was kind of a princeling, an aristocrat from a very wealthy family, and he was also a very macho guy, very brave. He was always getting into fights, always, and his sense of himself as a macho guy was very, very important to him. And one day he was walking along in the rain when he saw a leper lying at the side of the road. And this man was in the last stages of the disease. I don't know if you've probably never seen someone with leprosy, but it was a very grotesque and scary sight. Eyes caved in, flesh decayed, crawling with maggots. And he was horrified by this sight, and he was scared of catching the disease. So he ran away. And then he realized that he, Macho Baba Amte, had run in fear. And he was so appalled by this that he forced himself to go back. And there wasn't that much he could do for this man, but he covered him with a blanket to protect him from the rain. And he decided that the only way he was going to be able to restore his sense of himself after this display of cowardice was to steer directly into this fear. And he decided to make leprosy his life's work. And he had trained as a lawyer, so he decided, okay, I need some additional training. He enrolled in the School of Tropical Medicine. And while he was there, he understood that one of the reasons that there was still no cure for leprosy was that it seemed to be impossible to transmit the disease to animals for the purpose of experiments, as you normally would. And he thought about this for a day, and then he offered himself as a human experimental subject. And he was injected with a leprosy bacillus, but he didn't catch the disease. We now know that it's actually very, very difficult to catch leprosy, but he did not know that then. As it happened, shortly after he graduated from this medical school, there was a cure found, the drug dapsone, but then, as now in India, many people could not afford medical care, so if they even could get to a doctor eventually, they often didn't go until the disease was very far advanced, by which time the symptoms were so unmistakable and so repellent and terrifying to people that leprosy patients still had pretty much all of the same problems they'd had before the cure was found. They were thrown out of their families, thrown out of their villages, sometimes burned alive. And so even though there was a cure, leprosy colonies were still necessary, and he decided to found one. And he applied to the state for land, and he was given this tract of wilderness in the middle of nowhere, and he moved out there with his wife and his two sons, who were then ages 1 and 2, and 6 leprosy patients to start this community. And it was filled with wild animals. It was mostly forested area, lots of panthers. And they brought with them 4 dogs to protect them from these wild animals, but one by one, each of the dogs was carried off and eaten by a panther. Now, I went there a few years ago, and it's now a flourishing community. It's really an extraordinary place. It's about 3,000–4,000 people who live there now, and it's not just a refuge for the desperate. People live there their whole lives because they want to. And I could talk for hours about how amazing this place is. It's a beautiful place. It has a college. It has several schools. It has vocational training programs. People live there and get married and have kids and stay there. But this is the amount of sacrifice I am talking about. The panthers did not carry off and eat his baby sons as they did the dogs, but they might have done. They had no shelters at first. And his sons did not catch leprosy, but they might have done. And he was prepared to take that risk. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So this conflict between duty to family, or feeling for family, and strangers came up for everybody I wrote about in this book. But it took different forms. And I'll give you a different example, in some ways an opposite example. This is this couple that I mentioned who grew up in Barre, Vermont. Their names are Sue and Hector, and they were high school sweethearts. And Sue, when she was, I think, the age of 12, in middle school, she read a book called The Family Nobody Wanted, about a couple who had adopted this big group of kids, and who otherwise would not have gotten a home. And she always thought that sounded so appealing. She really wanted to do that when she grew up. So when she and Hector decided to get married, they decided that they would have 2 kids, biological kids, and they would adopt 2. And they did that. But then they became involved in the adoption world, and they realized just how many children out there are unlikely ever to get families, either because it's no problem for infants, usually, but many kids are too old, or they're too sick, or they're the wrong race, or they have too many brothers and sisters. For some reason, they are unlikely to be adopted. And when Hector and Sue thought about all these kids who were likely to spend their whole childhoods going from foster home to foster home to foster home, never having a family at all, they could not bear it. And so they started to adopt more and more and more. And they ended up adopting 20 special needs kids, special needs in the adoption sense. They're not necessarily physically ill, but they are unlikely to be adopted. 20 20 adopted kids in addition to the 2 biological kids that they had. And at first it was really fun, living with this multiracial brood of kids, and they were always putting on theatrical productions and all having lots of fun that you can have in a very, very big family. And their kids loved having new kids to play with. They would welcome the new ones coming into the family. But as the years went on, there were some very hard times. Sue and Hector always tried to instill in their kids the importance of not getting pregnant before you were able to give the child a stable home, because obviously they'd spend their lives caring for kids whose parents had not waited, who had had the children, they were unable to take care of them. But one by one, every single one of their girls became pregnant without a stable partner. And the day the last one told them she was pregnant, Hector first started to scream at her, and then he started to cry. He really felt that his life had been a waste. He left the house, he got on a train, and he spent the whole day. By this time they were living in Philadelphia. He got on a train and went up and down outside the city and back again, just crying and praying a lot of the way. And as they adopted more and more kids and they started asking the older kids to help take care of the younger kids, some of the older kids started to complain, and they said, "Mom and Dad, you cannot adopt every kid in the world. You're not giving us enough attention. We need more from you than you're able to give with this many kids." And for an ordinary parent, I think that would have been the end of it. It's making my kids unhappy, I'm gonna stop. And I wanna emphasize that this was a real family. This was not an orphanage. And so it hurt Sue and Hector to hear this as much as it would hurt any parent. But the difference between them and an ordinary parent is that even though they loved their children as much as any parent did, they still could not forget about those children out there who would never have a family if they did not adopt them. And they thought, even if it makes the children that we have a little worse off to bring in more kids into the family, if it dramatically transforms the life of that new child who is still a stranger to us, then it's worth it. And in the end, it was worth it. They held their family together through some extremely hard times, and now almost all of the kids still live within walking distance of Sue and Hector's house in Philadelphia. They're in and out of each other's homes all the time, minding each other's children. They created a real family. Now, these are obviously really difficult choices to make. Were they right to keep adopting so many kids? Was Baba Amte right to expose his family to such extraordinary risks? Did they draw the line between family and strangers in the right place? So going into this project, I knew that people would disagree about the right thing to do and whether they had drawn that line in the right place. But something I discovered in working on this that I did not expect was that many people do not admire this degree of moral commitment at all. There are kind of 2 cliches that I kept running into talking to people about the people I was meeting that are to some extent in conflict. One is the idea that whereas evil people are fascinating and complex, good people are boring and insipid, which I hope from these stories already you've gathered is not the case, but I ran into it over and over again, and I remember having a conversation with a novelist at one point, and I said, why is it that I was trying to find fictional representations of these people, and I couldn't, or it was very hard to do. There are not as many as I would expect. And I said, why is it that you novelists don't write more about extraordinarily moral people? And he gave me this look of total contempt, like I'd asked him to write a novel about puppies or butterflies or something. And I was like, this is what I have to contend with. On the other hand, there's this sort of opposite intuition about these people, that they are, there's something totally off about them, that they're messed up in the head. Something like half the people I spoke to about this book project, and the people I was meeting said, well, they're all mentally ill, right? And I thought, wow, that's weird. No, they're not all mentally ill, but how interesting and sad that you should say that. And I became really interested in this skepticism that I was hearing in different forms, and I ended up sketching a kind of a history of this skepticism in our culture. And I came to the conclusion that in the past couple of hundred years, first, it sort of arose in two stages. This is very rough, forgive me, but first it came to seem that helping people was more difficult and liable to backfire than perhaps it had seemed previously. And then the motives for helping people came to seem more suspect than they had before, with the result that living an ethical life had come to seem much less appealing. So for instance, I'll just sketch out a couple of landmarks, well-known landmarks. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, as I'm sure you all know, argued that a man pursuing his own self-interested ends, in combination with many others doing the same thing, could produce a benefit for society as a whole that was potentially good or maybe even better than if he had tried to bring about that good on purpose. And this, now mind you, Adam Smith was not a proponent of selfishness. He was a moral philosopher who would have abhorred some of the uses to which his work has been put. But this idea implanted deep in Western culture the notion that individual selfishness could be beneficial for society as a whole, and that if the moral goal were producing good as opposed to self-perfection, that a selfish person could do as much good as a selfless one. And then a century later, Darwin's Origin of the Species introduced the idea that the selfish struggle for survival was the basis for life itself. Now, again, Darwin was not arguing that selfishness is more characteristic of humans than altruism. To the contrary, he believed that altruism could be accounted for by natural selection because groups who helped each other out would prosper more than groups that were constantly fighting and would not help each other. So to him, it seemed perfectly natural. But this argument was not found to be convincing by a majority of biologists for a long period of time, and was instead, altruism seemed to be something that needed to be explained. It didn't make sense. It didn't seem to comport with natural selection, and so it was explained away as kin selection. You might seem to be helping someone out, but you're actually trying to benefit your own genes indirectly by helping your family, or by reciprocal altruism, the idea that, well, you may appear to be helping somebody, but only because you expect that they'll eventually help you back. So in other words, altruism had to be explained as some kind of selfishness in disguise. And then in the 20th century, the move towards skepticism I think increased by the sense that even the impulse to help was not just ineffective, but something insidious, something kind of sinister and even perverse. There's a wonderful book called The Gift by the French anthropologist, 1925 book, the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, that argues that in certain traditional societies, giving had to be reciprocal, that a gift given without expectation of anything in return was not, as we might think of it, a higher, better act, but on the contrary, it was something aggressive, that it would be perceived as setting yourself up as superior to the person who was receiving your gift and making them lose face. It was humiliating to give an unreciprocated gift. And in certain languages, he found the word gift had a second meaning. Unreciprocated gift had a second meaning, which was poison. And in Freud, again, like this, just hitting the main landmarks here, to Freud also, an excessive altruism he characterized as moral masochism. And his daughter, Anna Freud, who was also a very well-known psychoanalyst, she was even more suspicious. She coined this term, altruistic surrender, to describe the perversion of a person who was unable to gratify his or her feelings directly and so had to do so through a proxy. And this kind of suspicion of altruism is not just in, I mean, I've given you the sort of a kind of intellectual history, but it's not just a matter of intellectual high culture that it exists in, but also in popular culture as well. And I'll give you one example of this that was very striking to me. As I'm sure you all know, one of the innovations of Alcoholics Anonymous was to spread the idea that alcoholism was not a sin, but a disease. Al-Anon, the organization that was founded by the spouses of alcoholics some decades later, had spread a much more radical, to my mind, idea, which was that the helping of trying to help an alcoholic to recover from alcoholism was a symptom of the same disease. So the reason I think this is, in some ways, more radical innovation is that it took, alcoholism was a bad thing either way, whether it's a sickness or a sin, you want to get rid of it. But the idea that something that had once seemed to be saintly, admirable, the self-abnegating spouse of an alcoholic trying to get him to quit, the idea that that was not only ineffective, but kind of a form of sickness was really a very significant, I think, moral innovation. And it became even more widespread later in the 70s and 80s when that term was taken out of the narrow context of alcoholism and spread much more widely under the rubric of codependency. The idea that somebody who's trying to help somebody else is a kind of, it's a form of control. You're trying to control them, you're trying to set yourself up as superior and make them behave in the way that you think they ought to behave. So now helping in certain ways came to look not just not effective, but aggressive and not virtuous at all. And I read a lot of psychiatric and psychological articles about altruism for this book, and many of them seem to be pathologizing in a similar way to the way I've just described. But there was one syndrome that really did strike me, actually, which was the syndrome of the parentified child. This is the idea that a kid who grows up in a home where at least one of the parents is not functioning as a parent, either because he or she is an alcoholic or severely mentally ill, or for some reason is not functioning as a parent. And the idea is that this kid will try to, obviously most kids in that situation are just really messed up by it, but some kids react by trying to fix it. And they may try to be the perfect student, or they may try to help take care of their younger siblings, clean the house, learn how to cook, take care of their parent, something like that. And the idea is that when this kid grows up, they will feel obligated to try to fix the world in the way that they tried to fix their family as a child. And at first, when I read this, I thought this is just yet another one of these theories that's trying to make altruism look pathological. But then I thought about the people I talked to, and not all of them, but a very large number of them fit this profile, that one or other of their parents was either alcoholic or mentally ill. And so I thought maybe there is something to this theory, but again, I want to push back on the pathologizing implication of it, because, suppose you have a child who is, who by their less than perfect family is pushed towards altruism. Well, think about another child who, because they have two wonderful parents who believe in educating this child to be altruistic, to care for others, that second child is going to feel equally obliged to help take care of people. And so I was wondering, is the child who is compelled by his bad parents, the child who's compelled by his good parents, is one feeling of obligation more free or more true than the other? The question seems to me more, are they wrong to feel that way? So it may seem odd after how I've described the lives of Baba Amte and Sue and Hector, but all of the people I wrote about, I chose people who, to my mind, were living their moral lives successfully. And part of doing that was knowing their limits, knowing when to stop. And I'll give you an example of this. I first met this woman, Julia Wise, when she was in her early 20s. And she had always believed that she was no more valuable than anybody else. And to her, that suggested that she was obligated, it was unjust that she should have so much. She grew up in suburban Richmond, Virginia. And she thought it was unjust that she should have so much more than everyone else. And many people feel this way as kids, but she actually did something about it. So she decided, in college, she thought, well, what I should do about it is become a foreign aid worker. But then, as she grew older, she thought, well, that's a sort of politically dubious thing to do, and I really don't know anything about medicine. I'm not a doctor. I don't know anything about other countries. Why would I go bumbling about trying to fix other countries? Maybe the more humble, certainly less glamorous, but more humble thing to do would be to stay here, take my good college degree. She went to Bryn Mawr, get a first world salary, get a job, get a first world salary, and give as much of it as I possibly can away to organizations in other countries that I have, through research, determined are doing really, really good work. And so she decided to do this. And at first, when she made this decision, it made her life a total misery. Somebody else who had a similar sensibility to her described it really well. He said, nobody would buy a soda if there was a starving child standing next to the vending machine. Well, for me, there's always a starving child standing next to the vending machine. In some ways, I mean, I think there's a connection between the moral impulse and the aesthetic impulse. There is a level of imagination required to sustain that picture in your mind that keeps people like this going. So this is how she felt at first. And so every time she went to the supermarket, it was a complete misery. She would, want to buy peanut butter, and she was thinking, $4 for $4, I could buy rehydration salts for, 2 kids and possibly save their lives. How can I possibly buy peanut butter? And she would drive herself out of her mind at every moment. But she realized, like, if I make myself completely insane, this will not help anybody. I have to figure out some kind of system. And she and her husband, who is fortunately of similar predilection, they got together and they figured out a system whereby they would give away 50% of what they had and use the rest for rent and food. And they wouldn't worry about every single jar of peanut butter. But because she was in her early 20s, she still had to make 2 decisions that everyone has to make, or most people have to make around that age, which would set the course of her life, which was to have, whether or not to have children, and what she should do as a job. And she had, since she'd given up the idea of being a foreign aid worker, she really wanted to be a social worker. She thought she would be good at it. She loved the idea of helping a person right in front of her. Her giving to charity was what she believed she ought to do, but it wasn't gratifying. She really wanted to help someone in a more tangible way. But, of course, as you know, social workers don't earn very much money. And deciding to become a social worker would be to give up quite a bit of money that she could have made in some other career, like being a lawyer. And she thought, if I were a lawyer, that would be a far more moral choice, but she really didn't want to do it, but she wrestled with this decision. Ultimately, she decided that she would not be able to sustain her commitment over the long haul if she chose something to do that she would really hate. So she decided to become a social worker. But it was a tough decision. I mean, for her, by her lights, deciding to give up that salary was no different than if she had become a lawyer and spent that extra money on clothes or travel. Same thing, because from the point of view of the people who would receive the help, it worked out the same. And then there was the question of the child, and she thought again, if I have a child, I will be doing the equivalent of killing somebody else's child, because even though I will be a very weird and thrifty mother, I will inevitably spend some resources on this child that I would otherwise have given away. So do I have the right to do that? And as you can imagine, framed that way, it was quite a hard decision for her, and we talked about this for a long time. She and I, when I would go see her, her husband, by the way, not that I'm leaving him out of this very important decision, but he was kind of neutral on the subject of children. He was happy to go either way. So that's why it was really her decision. And she ultimately decided that if I don't have a child, this is the point at which I break. This is the point at which I will feel that my life is so bleak and so far from what I had hoped for from life that I will, again, lose my moral commitment for the long haul. So she decided to have a kid. So this conflict between family and strangers was, for everyone I spoke to, pretty much the deepest conflict in their moral life. And I think this is another reason to add to my list of why people are skeptical about very moral people, because I think it can seem to many of us that there should be no sacrifice too great that you make for your family. And the idea that people would contemplate such a sacrifice can seem kind of strange and unnatural. There's a philosopher I love called Bernard Williams who has a thought experiment about this. He says, imagine a man standing on a beach, and there are two people drowning over here, and his wife is drowning over here, and the man thinks, is it morally permissible for me to save my wife instead of the two people? And Williams said, you know, this man is having one thought too many. And when he saves his wife, he should probably not tell her about his complicated moral dilemma. And this might seem obviously right, but in fact, it's not. Because, you know, your wife or your mother or your child or someone close to you and dear to you versus two strangers, that might seem to be a fairly easy calculation. But what if it is 10 strangers? Or what if it's 100 strangers? Or what if it's 10,000 strangers? In fact, at some point, everyone is going to start to feel guilty. And I would argue that they are right to feel that way. Because this is not a purely hypothetical question that I'm asking, but a situation that approximations of which do actually arise in wartime. And in wartime, moral questions tend to look rather different to all of us, not just to do-gooders. So in wartime, it's thought to be dutiful rather than unnatural to leave your family behind, possibly forever, for the sake of a larger cause. And in ordinary times, to ask a person to risk her life for a stranger would seem outrageous, but in wartime it's completely normal. And I think one of the many reasons, another reason that there's all this skepticism about extreme do-gooders is that it's been a long time since there's been conscription in this country for what was widely considered to be a just war, which is to say World War II. Obviously there was conscription for Vietnam, but people were very ambivalent and critical of that war, as we know. So there's very few people left alive in this country who have had the experience of living through a time when it is normal, ordinary, and expected of everybody to sacrifice, be prepared to sacrifice a brother, a father, a son for a larger cause. And I think because that experience is no longer common to all of us, that is one of the reasons that now thinking of sacrificing a family member or someone dear to you for a larger cause now seems so unnatural and extreme. And I think this is another one of the reasons that most of us, to go back to my question from the beginning, don't do more than we do. It's not just selfishness, though that's obviously part of it, but also the sense that this is a genuine uncertainty and ambivalence about what is the best way to live and what is a good life, and whether it is right to sacrifice dear ones for the sake of strangers. But, you know, sometimes people would ask Sue and Hector why they'd chosen to live the way they did, because obviously people found it very puzzling. I should add, I didn't mention this, Hector comes from a biological family of 16 kids. So for him, the 22 kids, it was a lot, but it wasn't as extreme as it was for most of us. And people would ask, but people would still be puzzled by why they had chosen to live this way, and they would say, why couldn't you have adopted just a few kids and had an easier, more comfortable life? And I think that's the way a lot of people would think about it. But the thing about people like Sue and Hector and Baba Amte and Julia is that they have this deep and happy sense of purpose. They didn't want an easy life. And of course they sacrificed a lot of comfort, but in exchange they go through life feeling that they are helping other people and living their own lives the way that they ought to. And how many of us, I can't say that, and how many of us can say that? So, thank you.
front of a lot of people standing up to the microphone. But since there are a lot of you and presumably have a lot of questions, I hope you will tame your inner academic philosopher and not ask questions that go on for too long, and then not ask like follow-up after follow-up after follow-up. Okay, so would someone like to be brave and go first?
We can also move the microphone around, if anybody would like. Would you like the mic? Sure, yes.
Shall I give you this microphone for the other half of the
Oh, sure.
room?
Great. There you go.
So, thank you. That was just really interesting. And I was thinking about a piece that maybe you wrote in the New Yorker quite some time ago about somebody who kept giving his organs away. Was that you who wrote that piece?
It wasn't, though. It was written by the wonderful Ian Parker, but he and I both had the same idea, and to my endless frustration, his editor was like, "Great idea." My editor was like, "No, that's not really very interesting." So he did a great job. Frustrating.
It's all part of that. So, so I'm an early modernist, and meaning, you know, like I study things in the 16th and 17th century, and I think that if I go back even a little bit further, these people used to be called saints. So I'm wondering, because you didn't mention religion at all, and that's clearly part of the moral universe that is involved in this kind of altruism, whether your book talks also about religious impulse or, you know, the kind of long history of this kind of behavior in people that, you know, some churches call saints. Interestingly, you know, we're in the All Saints period right now, so there's something. It was just the other day, so.
Absolutely. I mean, though it's one of the things that's interesting to me. I mean, first of all, the people I wrote about, some of them are religious and some are not. So, so Baba Amte, for instance, is an atheist, a very fierce atheist, though his wife is was a very religious Hindu. Julia and her husband are atheists. Sue and Hector are devout Christians. It's about 50-50 in terms of the people I wrote about. And I was talking to one of the people I wrote about is a Methodist pastor, and I asked her what difference she thought it made, whether someone was religious or not. And she said she'd been talking about this very question with someone, and she felt that if you're not, there's an additional layer of despair because you think, you know, we are alone here, and if I don't do this, nobody's going to do it. Whereas if you're a person of faith, you think, it's incumbent upon me to try as hard as I can, but ultimately the fate of the world is not my business. It's God's business, and it's out of my hands. Obviously, there's going to be differences of opinion. I don't want to generalize, but it's not just we humans bumbling about. There's something else forcing the path of the universe. And one of the things that I was also interested to read about, and I hesitate I don't want to elaborate on this too much because it's something I don't know enough about, but I think there is quite a profound difference between different religious traditions in how they consider this question that I'm interested in about family versus strangers. So it's my sense, and if there's a historian of religions or a theologian in the audience, I would love to hear elaboration on this, but in a very crude level, it's my sense that, for instance, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism have a lot of room for a certain kind of saint who, for spiritual and or moral reasons, leaves his family behind and pursues a different path, where an ascetic or a path aside from his family and community, whereas Judaism and Islam are far more ambivalent about that. There's much more of a sense, at least in some strains of those traditions, that no, you must take care of your family, and then you must take care of your community, and only then is it okay to help strangers. But first you must make sure that your family is all right. So there are divisions, in other words, within the traditions. I think sometimes it's too easily assumed that every tradition advocates a kind of universal love, but I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Thanks. So the way you ended the talk, you might have been suggesting that one thing these people you've written about were not sacrificing was their own happiness, at least their happiness rightly understood, that they were ultimately making choices that led to their own personal fulfillment. So I'm curious as to whether that's the case, or whether it was true of some of the folks you wrote about that they were and understood themselves to be sacrificing their own well-being in the sense of leading lives that were substantially less contented and fulfilled as a result of making the altruistic choices they made.
Yeah, it's very interesting. This is a very interesting question, and I was just talking about this with the person sitting next to you. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but we were having an argument about this earlier. You know, I think that all of them, as I said at the end, do feel on balance that they are living lives filled with more purpose than other kinds of more ordinary lives. But I think that's partly a matter of training of their desires. You know, these are all people who felt a certain moral commitment at a very early age. And at that, they figured out, just as Julia figured out a system whereby she was not constantly in agony about whether or not to buy peanut butter, she also trained herself to want certain things and not others. So I think it's very difficult to say, were they sacrificing or not? I mean, Julia, for instance, just to stick with her for a minute, I mean, she loves material things. She loves baking. She loves, you know, I think her ideal existence would be living on a farm and keeping animals and having lots of kids and planting flowers and baking pies. She kind of has a Laura Ingalls Wilder thing. You know, she loves that stuff, and she's given that up. But would she be happier in that life? I'm not sure, and she's probably not sure either. But I mean, something else I want to, and this is one of the things we were talking about earlier, is a lot of the people, and I'm not suggesting this is you, but a lot of people I've spoken to about these kinds of issues say, well, but surely these people are making themselves happy by doing this, and therefore it doesn't really count in some way, or it counts less. And that's what I want to push back on, is first of all, would you really think it'd be a better person if they were miserable doing good for others? You know, like, why should it discount their virtue, as it were, if they are made happy by making others better off? But there is a very widespread, I think, assumption that that is the case, that it's only if they're really at all times feeling the sacrifice as a sacrifice that it fully counts. And I don't think that's so. But the larger answer is, I think it's impossible to extricate their sort of baseline desires and calculate how much sacrifice they're making, because it's a matter of training your desires to accommodate your beliefs.
Somebody has their...
There's a gentleman over there. Oh, it's coming towards you from the right.
Okay. Would you say that today's attitude towards selfishness as opposed to altruism is different to the way it was 50 years ago within my lifetime?
Well, so it's hard for me to say, because I mean, I think I'm not a historian, and I didn't do a sort of exhaustive. I think it would be a very, very interesting question. I would love to read a much more in-depth history of our moral culture. I do think conscription is one factor that has changed our moral culture. On the other hand, again, something we were talking about earlier in Tyler's class, so two little historical facts about the philosopher Peter Singer strike me as very interesting. I think if you asked if we took a poll who thinks that the moral the sense of duty that people have has increased over time, I think very few people would believe that. Most people think we are more hedonic, and I mean more easy on ourselves than we once were, and there's this whole greatest generation thing, and that, you know, that's I think probably the prevailing belief, which is why I found it interesting, these two little facts about Peter Singer. One is, so he's in case anyone is not familiar with his name, he's a very influential moral philosopher who now teaches at Princeton. He has a very demanding sense of what is required of us morally, and he, in an essay he wrote sometime in the 80s, he describes as an example of an extraordinarily moral person a mother who gave one of her kidneys to save the life of her son. And I was very struck by that because I thought, well, that is odd, because I would think now that would be a completely ordinary thing to do. And in fact, if a mother did not give a kidney to save the life of her son, it would be regarded as maybe okay, but kind of very dubious. And so I thought, well, if Peter Singer in the 80s, you know, those decades ago, thought that that was extraordinary, maybe our sense of duty has increased, not decreased. Another fact that he mentioned is that apparently he wrote a very famous essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality, in which he made the argument that it is incumbent upon us, all of us, to give away, he focused on money, to the point where because we're all equally worthy, to give away money to the point where pretty much we are worse off than the worst off in the world by giving away the extra penny. So basically everything that you have, you owe to relieve the suffering of others who are worse off than you are. And he said that when he, in the early years after that essay was published, which was in the early 70s and let's say the 70s and 80s, this argument was taught in schools as, this conclusion is obviously crazy. Where's the flaw? Where does he go wrong? Find the misstep that led to this obviously insane conclusion. And he said nowadays it's actually often taught as, is this right or not? Do you agree or not? So, you know, these are obviously tiny little anecdotal pieces of evidence, but I find them striking. And so it may be that actually our sense of what's required of us is not diminishing, as probably most people would think, but increasing. There's a woman there.
Do you think that there's a certain sense of privilege, whether like conscious or unconscious, that's associated with this like do-gooder mentality?
No, not necessarily. I mean, Baba Amte certainly was a very rich young man when he made this decision, but and he also kind of had a sort of overweening authoritarian personality that you could certainly make that argument about. But no, other people I wrote about come from very, very, very modest backgrounds, and I think the normal thing, as I said at the beginning, is to help people like yourself. I mean, that there's I'm not going to be able to call up the numbers, but certainly in this country, the percentage given to charity is far higher among people in the bottom income brackets than in the top, which, you know, of course, it's much more money. It might be much more money coming from rich people, but as a percentage, much less. So no, I don't think so. And I think that's part of the skepticism that I'm trying to push back against, that kind of thing. Yeah.
What were these people's social relationships like with their parents or their siblings or their neighbors?
Really complicated because, as I say, you know, their commitments were such that they felt, in all cases, that they owed enough to strangers that they did not give their families what families usually expect. I mean, for instance, I wrote about people who gave away one of their kidneys to a stranger, and the reaction was, at best, you're a weirdo, why would you do such a bizarre thing? And at worst, many family members felt, well, what about us? Why would you give away a kidney to a stranger? What if your child or your mother needs that kidney? How could you do that? That is the wrong thing to do. And the fact is that, you know, kidneys don't necessarily, you're not necessarily a better match for I mean, that's a technical detail. You're not necessarily a better match for your relative than for a stranger. But that, the issue was, and many people find this degree of commitment just cold and unnatural, as I said, to privilege helping strangers over family. So, you know, it was also difficult. I mean, one of the things I talked to Julie and Jeff about is, how does it work with friends? You know, they don't go out to dinner. They don't go to a movie. They don't do these normal things that friends do with each other because it costs too much money and it costs too much time. But more than those practical barriers, I said, like, how do you form friendships with people who don't share your moral beliefs? And they kind of didn't. I mean, one of the interesting things, though, that happened was that in the course of the time that I was working on this book and talking to Julia and Jeff, when I first met them, which was, I think, in 2010, they felt almost completely isolated. They couldn't, friends, as you can imagine, would feel reproached, would feel judged by them, and it was very difficult for them to respect somebody who did not, in their view, do their moral duty. And so they were very isolated. But in the course of the following 5 years, this movement arose called effective altruism. It turned out that there were actually quite a few people who shared their beliefs, and it kind of coalesced first on university campuses and then over the internet, and now they have a whole social world comprised of people who believe these same things. So that problem has been solved for them, but it's also, it's really difficult, and this is, I think, one of the reasons that people wanted to talk to me is because, you know, it's difficult they all felt, everyone I spoke to felt obliged to try to persuade other people to do more of what they did. But they're not idiots. They fully realize that's going to alienate people very quickly. And so they would go back and forth, like, well, I shouldn't say anything because it will alienate people and that would be bad, but then maybe I just don't want to say something, and so I'm just making excuses, and if I was a better person, I would force myself to. And so I gave them a way to speak to people without alienating someone in front of them. You know, they could tell their story and try to persuade people through me, through somebody else, which was an easier way to do it. But it is a problem for all of them, and it's interesting because I think that one of the things that I think is a problem for this kind of person is that there's a very strong prescription in our culture against being judgmental. And people hate that. And I think it's very overvalued as a character type. I mean, it's annoying when someone is judgmental, but I mean, compared to someone who does nothing for anybody else, is that person, you know, a delightful cynic, really better than somebody who's a little judgmental? But even beyond that, I think, you know, Julia is definitely judgmental. People would say, well, isn't she, you know, doesn't she judge other people? And I said, yes, but that's not, I think this is a mistake that people make about this, this mode of being. She's judgmental, but not out of a sense of superiority, but out of a sense that she's just like everybody else. It's more offensive to my mind to not be judgmental, because that suggests, like, well, if, you know, I'm doing my thing, but no one else can possibly aspire to be as good as me. But she doesn't feel that way. She thinks, I'm just a regular person. I also would like to go to the beach and, like, buy a car and travel and do all these things that you want to do, but I'm not doing it. And how can you do it? Because you're just the same as me. So I think it's, people are too judgmental about judgmentalness, is what I think.
Was what you learned from working on the book helpful to you personally, or did it just leave you feeling more puzzled, or maybe feel worse about your own inclinations?
Definitely felt worse, but I felt bad to begin with, so that's why I was on this road to start with. I mean, one thing that was very helpful was thinking in a more organized way about where to give. So I had, like most people, given to causes that seemed moving to me. And people like Julia and Jeff, and this effective altruist movement, want to spread the idea that it's extremely important. It's not just about giving money away and feeling good if you've passed a certain level, but that it's extremely important part of giving money away to figure out which is the best place to give it. And so there's allow me to recommend a site called Givewell, which is a organization that analyzes whether charities are actually being effective at what they do and how much bang for the buck. Their approach is very much bang for the buck, which usually works out to recommending medical charities in developing countries, usually. not exclusively. I think that's it's interesting because it would seem that that's an obvious cause, but it's actually kind of hard to push that cause of looking for effective charities, because one of the people who's involved in this movement was saying to me, you would think that it would be very easy to persuade people to give to more effective charities, because who wouldn't want to do more good for their dollar? But getting people to give more money is quite difficult because it involves sacrifice. And he actually found that the opposite was true, that people are not that rational, that if you move someone emotionally, it's actually quite easy to get them to give more. But getting them to abandon causes that they are emotionally invested in and believe in for a long time, to switch to some other charity that is mathematically superior, that's very hard.
To sort of go off that point and to go back to the question of, well, not without straying into politics too much, there's an idea that people who are wealthy and people who are at the top stratosphere of income, although they're making a lot of money and taking that for themselves, there's a philosophy of giving back to society in a way that is more productive than if that was distributed amongst everybody equally. So talking about effective charity, is there a sense that has changed over time? Because there's the age of robber barons where they had a lot of money but then created Carnegie Hall and all these great public works. Do you find that higher income, and have you talked to anybody who has a very high income and donates a lot or gives a lot and tries to find a way to make that effective, and has that changed over time?
I did not talk to people who, I was not really interested in how much people had to start with. I was interested in how much they had left. So I did not talk to, someone like Bill Gates is doing an enormous amount of good, but he's not the kind of person I was focused on. I think one thing that may have changed, you bring up Carnegie Hall. I think one thing that may have changed is in part because of Gates. It now seems more likely for very rich people to give to causes like healthcare and development, whereas traditionally the robber barons would give to causes like the opera or libraries, or causes that were very visible in their home communities, that they could, buildings that they could put their names on, things that looked glamorous and usually most of the time served their own, their peers rather than people who had less. And I think, but I don't know. I'm just guessing. I think because of Gates's foundation, it's now more fashionable than it once was to give to that kind of cause, even though there aren't buildings and costumed people involved. Be interesting to know if that was true.
So sort of on the same, or a similar vein,
Sorry,
I'm
wait,
wondering.
I can't see who's speaking.
Oh, sorry,
oh,
I'm sure.
There you are.
Hi. I'm wondering if you think, or if there is a line when you're being an altruist of when you become sort of dangerously paternalistic. And I'm thinking of, times when, a Western morality has caused a lot of sort of unjust situations in colonies, or I'm thinking specifically of South Africa, but and the apartheid. But yeah, so kind of, yeah. Do you think there's a line of being too paternal and being an altruist?
Absolutely. That's. I think we can add that to our list of reasons that people are skeptical about altruism in general. Is that I think there's been a lot of very welcome skepticism and understanding, not just of the dubious politics of some forms of charity, but also the ineffectiveness of it. I think people are much more aware than they used to be that charitable impulses can be not just politically weird, but also very, very severely counterproductive. So for instance, in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, there were refugee camps over the border in Congo, on which descended any number of Western aid organizations who were providing food and medical care, and a cynical person I know said that they were in effect catering the genocide, because what they were doing was giving food and aid and general succor to people who had been killing, had fled, and gotten them to the point where they were able to go back and kill some more. And also, you know, I think people are much smarter now, again, leaving the politics aside, about the ways in which, for instance, food aid can disable the agricultural system of the recipient country, and yes, so absolutely that is a huge problem. But I mean, on the other hand, it's not so simple as charity is sort of colonial and bad, because then is the answer to just withdraw and give only to your family? Well, no. So, and there is of course inherent to the charitable impulse some sense that I have something to give you that you need, and that has a politics to it. But that's not to say that because that politics can get icky and bad in many situations and has done, that the answer is, well, just don't do it. You know, it's just remains really complicated. And I think it's been a very, very good feature of the past 20 years that aid organizations and people in general have gotten much, much smarter about both the politics and the practical aspects of charity and how it can go bad.